Good evening, and welcome to Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary's live stream event, God and Mammon, Economics and Moral Choice in the Wake of COVID-19. My name is Professor Ken Barnes, and I'll be your host for this evening. And as we do with all things at Gordon-Conwell, we'd like to begin this evening's proceedings with a word of prayer. Would you please join me in prayer? Heavenly Father, we give you thanks tonight for the wonder of technology that allows us to reach out to our sisters and brothers across the globe to consider difficult issues in the public square. Thank you, too, for your grace and mercy during this COVID-19 crisis, the effects of which will be felt for many years to come. Help us this evening to better understand the economic impacts, not only of the pandemic, but also the remedies conceived by our leaders in government and finance. Teach us what we need to know, Lord. Show us what we need to see, and give us economic wisdom in this age of COVID-19 and always. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Since we first explored this topic of the economic impact of COVID-19 last April, we've seen governments and central banks around the world pour tens of trillions of dollars into the global economy in an attempt to stave off its most serious effects. While these interventions have largely succeeded, they've also produced some unintended consequences, including an exacerbation of the wealth and well-being gap between rich and poor, white and people of color, as well as staggering amounts of debt, both public and private. The purpose of tonight's event is neither to persuade nor dissuade anyone regarding the merits of any particular economic policy. However, we do want to first explore the economic impact of COVID-19 with particular emphasis on underserved communities of color. Secondly, we want to address the legitimate ethical issues surrounding the monetization of the system and its effect on economic inequality and the risks that are associated with the aforementioned debt. And lastly, explore what the Bible has to say about economic justice and financial stewardship. Before I introduce our esteemed panel of experts, I'd like to just remind our viewers to post any questions you may have on the comments section of Facebook Live. And we'll do our best to raise them later in the broadcast. First, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Dr. Jim Longhurst. Dr. Longhurst has spent over 40 years as a church pastor, both in the United States and abroad, and currently serves as executive director of the Public Square Forum, which is a nonprofit organization that fosters conversations of consequence between local churches and their communities. Thank you, Jim, for being with us as always. And now it's my honor and privilege to introduce our panelists. First, Dr. Eve Poole. Dr. Poole is the Third Estate's Commissioner of the Church of England. She is a global thought leader in the integration of faith and economics, and she is the author of several books, including Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions and Buying God, Consumerism and Theology. And she's joining us tonight from the UK. So thank you, Eve. It's wonderful to have you with us. Next, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Robert Gough. Dr. Gough is a senior executive, a professor of economics, a futurist, and an advisor to governments and central banks across the globe. He was a special predictive analytics advisor to the work of President Ronald Reagan's Grace Commission, and is therefore an expert in this field. Bob, it's great to have you again with us tonight. Next, it's my joy to introduce my dear friend, Bishop Lawrence Ward. Bishop Ward is the senior pastor of Abundant Life Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He is a church and a community leader, and he has personal experience in the use of entrepreneurship as a tool for the promotion of human flourishing and community development. He is at the coalface of what is happening in communities of color in the wake of COVID-19. Larry, a joy to have you with us. And last but certainly not least is my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Sara Minard. Dr. Minard is a socio-economist, a professor. She is the founder and executive director of an international consulting firm, Minard. And she is, of course, the newly appointed associate director of the Mockler Center for Faith and Ethics in the Public Square at Gordon-Conwell, working her entire life, whether as a Peace Corps volunteer or as an academic or as a consultant in this space. And it's an honor and a privilege to have her on the panel tonight. So I'm going to kick off by going to you, Eve, and I really have a two-part question for you. The statistics about trillions of dollars that I mentioned at the start of the broadcast are generally US statistics, but the UK has experienced COVID-19 in a way that's just as bad as the US experienced. Can you please share with us, first of all, how life in the UK has been disrupted by the pandemic and how governments and the Bank of England have responded to the crisis? And then I'll ask a follow-up question on your book, Buying God. So tell us what's going on in the UK.
Well, it's very grim and Darwinian here, as I'm sure it is where you are, in that this particular virus seems to be taking out the vulnerable. So I think 60% of all those who've died in the UK are disabled. We know it disproportionately affects people of colour. And we know that particularly in the UK, those in care homes were the first to die, and those numbers have been really dreadful. So I think, like the rest of the world, we're reeling from this really dreadful zooming in on what was already broken about our society in terms of who do we honour and who do we care for. And our numbers are pretty bad. So unemployment's the worst it's been for over 5 years. Youth unemployment has been particularly badly hit. It was already around about the 15% mark. Probably about 20% of those under 24 of working age are unemployed. There's a whole generation who will never get on the ladder. And there's a real problem in the UK about how on earth we address that. We have about 20% of the working population currently on furlough, which is our equivalent of your PPP. So they are essentially on the government's payroll at the moment. And if you add into that people who are on the government's payroll anyway, at the moment, almost 50% of the workforce are basically being bankrolled by the Treasury. And again, we don't know what will happen when furlough ends. They keep extending it. I think it's being extended in the budget next week until next July, well, this coming July. But if those 20% people on furlough suddenly lose their jobs in the summer, that will obviously have a fairly catastrophic effect. Like the US, it's been very disproportionate in that those who are in kind of middle class jobs who can work from home have generally found that they have saved during the pandemic. They've been able to pay off credit card debt, they've been able to pay off loans. They have a huge fighting fund to go and spend when the economy opens up again. But again, it's those at the extreme ends of the spectrum, particularly the poor, who have been disproportionately affected. Last year, 2,600 parcels a day of food were given to children in this country. Just to give you a sense of the proportions, in 2008, there were only 26,000 people using food banks in the UK. That's our equivalent of like soup kitchens and stuff, where people donate food for those who can't afford to buy it for themselves. So if in 2008 that was 26,000 people, last year 1.9 million people had to use a food bank in the UK. And if you think about the population of Wales is about 3 million, that's 2/3 of Wales. And the population of Scotland is about 5 million. So that's, you know, a third of Scotland as an equivalent are using food banks on a regular basis. So it is a really dreadful picture. And of course, we have Brexit. Which means an awful lot of our smaller companies cannot afford the red tape now required. In Scotland, you can no longer actually export your shellfish because of the regulations. And so whole industries are just being wiped out because of that particular political choice. So while there are some good news headlines around sort of middle class debt and stamp duty holidays to try and stimulate the purchase of housing, again, it's only really helping those who really didn't need the help anyway. So I think with those of you in the US, we're feeling the pain and we're feeling really dreadful about what this has exposed in terms of underlying inequality, which is just going to get exponentially worse as we come out of this.
You know, most people don't realize that 2/3 of all the new jobs created in the United States are small business jobs, small entrepreneurial businesses. And of course, in the UK, famously a nation of shopkeepers, as it were. What's it like for the small stores on the high street and the local pubs? Are they going to make it?
Well, without furlough, they would have all been wiped out already. And it very much depends on whether this consumer boom will be realised in time. We're now starting our release from lockdown, but we're not expecting shops to open again this side of Easter. And so it really does depend how quickly that can get back. I mean, just walking around Edinburgh, there are lots of signs on shops where they haven't been able to make the payments. Some landlords have given rent holidays, but that's only a holiday, which means that you have just this cliff edge of payments due and no money to pay them. And of course, all the government help was focused on those who were employed through the furlough scheme. So if you're self-employed or you're a gig worker, the number of people having to apply for welfare has shot up, and that's been a real problem in terms of the bureaucracy involved to try and get that money out to people. So the destitution levels are really, really shocking in the UK at the moment.
So we so often focus on the government in these situations, but you wrote a wonderful book recently, Buying God, Consumerism and Theology. And in it, you talk a lot about what individual people can do, especially people of faith, to help their neighbors economically. Can you unpack a little bit about the basic premise of that book? Because I think a lot of people get intimidated by all the government talk and some of the things we're going to talk about with Bob in a minute, but they can relate to what they can do with their own pocketbook. Can you share some of that with us, please?
I'd love to. And I think that's going to be so important because when we are all allowed to spend again, it's really important that we make good choices about that. When I wrote my first book, the Toxic Assumptions book that was mentioned, which is much more of a sort of macroeconomic look at the sort of structures of capitalism. And Buying God is a sort of microeconomic look at what you can do. And it talks more generally about the forces of consumerism and what desire is theologically all about. And it makes the point that this is a system which is about messages of supply and demand, and we get the market we deserve. So we can have a market for £1 million handbags, or we can have a market for cheap vaccines that are freely available all around the globe to fight COVID. And that in some ways is our choice, because it is much quicker to change corporate behavior by consumer behavior than it is through regulation and government intervention. So the quickest way into this for me is to get you to imagine that your bank statement is it's like your kind of economic scorecard. So imagine you had turned up at the pearly gates and St. Peter wanted to know, what kind of an economic citizen are you? You could spin him a line, but actually, if you had to produce your bank statement, here is mine, what does it say about actually where your treasure is and where your heart is? So my challenge to you and to me is that every time your bank statement arrives, try and grade those transactions for the kingdom. I use a sort of red, amber, green with my highlighter pen. So local shopping, really good. We know from the Economics Foundation that if you spend £1 in a chain, it's worth about 36p to the local economy because of offshoring and headquartersing and all that kind of stuff. But if you spend your £1 in a local shop, a local hairdresser, a local florist, a local delicatessen, it becomes worth £1.76 because of the effect, the reinforcing effect of that money being spent within the community. So the more locally you can shop, which of course during lockdown has been the only way any of us can shop, the better. But do keep that up when all of those massive mega stores open. Really try and shop locally where you can. And try and figure out where your pound is going, whose pocket does it end up in, and is that a pocket you want to support or not? The thing about your bank statement is it requires you to do a lot of Googling to find out about supply chain. You know, have those companies signed up to the Ethical Trading Initiative? What is happening with slave trade? What is happening with their board, with their governance, with their footprint in terms of zero carbon? And also, what else is on your bank statement in terms of donations, your charitable giving, your giving to your church? Where is your income coming from? Is that income that makes you feel good? Is it from stocks and shares that maybe aren't quite right? Is it from a pension that may not be ethically invested? As soon as you start diving into your bank statement, it becomes a really sobering experience. So while you can't make St. Peter delighted immediately, I would imagine, because there'll be the odd bit of Amazon and stuff in there just because it's COVID and it's a nightmare. There is something about just gradually trying to ratchet up the number of kingdom spends in there so that there are just more votes in the system for the kingdom. So even though there's a lot more in my book than that, the quickest way into it for all of you listening tonight and when you watch this back later is please, next time your bank statement arrives in your inbox or on your mat, have a look at it and see if you can score more for the kingdom.
I love that expression, kingdom points. That's wonderful. I tell my students that every economic decision ever made was a moral choice, whether big or small. And we sometimes forget that. Thank you so much, Eve. And we're, of course, going to be coming back to you. Bob, I'd like to turn to you, if I may. Let's talk a little bit about some of the macro. You and I share a concern about the amount of debt being utilized to underwrite the cost of fighting the pandemic and its economic impact. Now, economists suggest that public debt is actually a myth. Inflation shouldn't be debt. And this, of course, is part of modern monetary theory, or the idea that the currency issuer of a fiat currency, which is the government, can pretty much just print money to get itself out of trouble. I wonder if you could just give us your take on this theory, which we call modern monetary theory, and how it influences our understandable fear of numbers like $1.9 trillion recovery package, the pros and the cons. And I'll have a follow-up question for you after. So just give us your take. Are you concerned at all about these numbers, or is it just the price we have to pay?
I'm very, I'm very concerned, Ken. And I want to say amen to Eve's point, about the fact that we tend to try to solve our problems. The great number of solutions that have been coming forth during the COVID times have all focused on simply one thing: money. Just make money available. The PPP program in this country, and other programs that simply focus on giving people money. And we have learned in so many contexts that just giving people money in the long run does not work. There needs to be other things that accompany it. Now, modern monetary theory is, in a sense, embraced along those intellectual lines. Just print the money, based upon the fact that governments are sovereign. And the argument is that governments should not burden the financial markets by being players and therefore driving up interest rates because of the money that they need. So therefore just print it. And one of the premises of modern monetary theorists is that debt is a myth, that debt doesn't matter. Well, I could spend the next 30 minutes simply just reading a list of times in our history throughout the world where debt has toppled economies. Debt is not a myth, it's real. And the level of debt that we have in the United States today is not solvable. It has become so intractable at the levels that it is. That I mentioned one of the live streams that I did with you before about the amount of money that Joshua might have if he lived over the 5,000 years from 2500 BC till today, and spent at the rate of $1 million today, he would have enough money left over to still spend for thousands and thousands of years. Debt is very, very difficult to pay back when you've got the amount of debt that we have. But we are not addressing it. If we think that COVID is a worldwide shock to our system, wait until the issue of debt comes to bear when it finally has to be dealt with. All we are doing is kicking the can down the street. Eventually, we will have to pay the price. In this country, we are fast approaching spending $1 trillion a year on just debt service. And that means money going back to the debt holders of the debt that's been issued. And that takes away from all sorts of programs that we could put in place. One good example that I often use is a woman by the name of Ambrosia Moyo, who's an African lady that studied and got her PhD at Oxford. And she wrote a very, very important book called Dead Aid. And in that book, she pleads with the West to stop giving money to Africa, because money simply enables people to remain dependent. And that applies to all sorts of programs in this country too. If you just give people money, it enables them to remain in a state of dependency. I did my work in graduate school on this whole topic of assistance, how to give people assistance. And one of the things that people know is that the concept of block grants have failed dramatically. What you need to do is give what is referred to as matching grants. Matching grants often refer to people kicking in some money on their own. That doesn't have to be the case. You can do all sorts of things. You can kick in time. You can kick in expertise. You can kick in teaching. You can kick in your knowledge. There needs to be an incentive when we help people, or else this debt, this amount of debt that we have will continue to pile up to the point where eventually it's going to be so high that we're not going to be able to afford to pay the debt service costs.
Okay, so let me ask you a follow-up, if I may, because I think most people would probably hear this and say, that's a good theory, but the fact of the matter is, this is a crisis. And maybe the problem is that we didn't fix the roof when the sun was shining. And so now when we have to incur debt, it's exacerbating a problem that we haven't addressed for the last 40 years. Would that be a fair criticism?
Yes, it would. But I will say that the amount of money that the government in this country has had to pay out on this stimulus program, while huge, was somewhat necessary because of what you just said, Ken, because of the fact that the problem has been there, which we have not addressed. One of the most obvious examples of what we could have done instead of simply just printing money and paying it out to people in relatively small magnitudes is we could have started an infrastructure program. This country is in desperate need of infrastructure repair. So we could have spent the kind of money that we've already spent and got some productivity back for it. So you can put people to work. You could put people to work repairing roads, building bridges, repairing the infrastructure in this country. You could put people to work in research programs. You could put people to work in new training programs to help people with disabilities. You could put people to work in all sorts of areas that improve treatments for people in need. This creates jobs instead of just printing money and sending checks to people's mailboxes. So, but we have had to do that because of the fact that what we really lack is we lack the creative thinking. I'm appalled, frankly, at the nature of thinking that's gone into these solutions. It's very, very easy to create debt and to create credit. That's one of the easiest things to do, and that's why we do it. It's much harder to create programs that are going to creatively address the issues that really are the root problems of our society.
So I want to come back to Eve just for a second, if I may. Eve, you and I were on a call yesterday with some theologians and economists talking about some issues in the UK. And one of the people said that they had an associate in Sweden who marveled at the UK's creative ability to address problems in crisis and not always default to just the government writing checks. If you recall that conversation, we happened to be talking about redundant churches and things, but the concept is the same. Is there a lack of creativity in the UK as well right now, or are you seeing the same problem that Bob was just talking about?
Well, I had a really interesting call with Andy Haldane, who is the chief economist at the Bank of England, about this, because we're actually borrowing from some of your FDR New Deal thinking around that very point about infrastructure projects. And it's very early thinking, but we're trying to figure out, if you do have this underclass of people who have left education and have never been able to be employed even before this crisis and now have had even more interruption, and you have house prices being what they are and all of the other structural problems we have, how on earth do you find a way to help that huge number of people of that age gain skills, socialize, earn money, all of those kinds of things? So instead of the sort of national service model of sending everyone off to be in the army for a while, he's talking to a variety of people about how could we create a kind of set of activities for that age group that would be about infrastructure, would be about the environment, would be about things that help rebuild the economy, but also give people something specific to do rather than, as Bob says, just get paid to sit around and feel depressed.
Fascinating.
Can I just ask
yes,
Eve something related to that, Eve, is the fact that some of the programs, the assistance programs in this country are so, when you add them all up, sometimes families will get more money from just being home and not working than going back to work. And so consequently, that has hurt our ability to put some of these programs in place, because a lot of these people, including from the additional money that was sent out in the PPP programs and the stimulus checks, they opted to stay home, because if they went back to work, they would actually make less money. And that's
that's absolutely the case in the UK, and it's a very intractable political problem, because the current administration is pursuing a particular approach to that, which is very different from what came before. So there have been lots of massive adjustment problems, and an awful lot of the food bank usage is because people haven't been able to transition into the right welfare payments in time. So they have often several weeks of being unable to collect any money to pay for anything, and therefore have to rely on handouts from charities. I think you're right that particularly with the gig economy and the way all of that works, people having to work around the clock, if they are trying to get employment. So one of the conversations I'm very involved with in the UK at the moment is trying to resurrect the idea of universal basic income, even if that was just as a year of post-COVID recovery, in order to buy people a bit of time to have a think about what skills they might need, what training they might want to access, and just to be able to facilitate a whole load of industries that have been forgotten about. All the creative industries, all the artists, the dancers, the musicians, they're the gig economy as well. And so there's a really interesting conversation here about how you might pull that off in a way that would give people dignity and also have this transition.
There's an opportunity to apply more creative thinking with regard to universal income, because you could apply a universal income with the qualification that someone attend retraining programs and not just sit at home for a year. Because after we cure COVID, we really have to focus on curing ignorance, in the policymaking circles in terms of the nature of the way we're going about this. I'm a great supporter of all these issues and programs that you raise, for example, in your book. But but I'm very concerned about the way we're doing it here in this country. It's costing us far more money and accumulating far more debt than would be necessary if we did it in a more intelligent way.
So I'd like to build a bridge, if I may, from these macro discussions back to the micro discussions, and in specific terms to how a local church or local churches, people in their communities, can actually use entrepreneurship as a way of addressing some of these problems. And so, Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk to Bishop Ward, because I know that Larry has been involved at the coalface of this kind of creative thinking in praxis. And thank you, Eve and Bob. We're going to come back to you. But Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you to invite Bishop Ward to talk about what he's actually done in Boston.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. And Bishop Ward, we are looking at the whole of the reality from another angle, and how the effects of COVID-19 on families and communities, and particularly to Black leaders like yourself. You've been saying that for a long time, that there's a link between financial well-being and issues of justice. So what's happening? How has your community there in Cambridge and the greater Boston area, how have they been affected by the pandemic, both physically and socially and economically, and how have people responded?
Well, thanks, Jim. Here's where my thoughts are on that question. There's a macro part of it, and there's a micro part of it. On a macro level, when COVID had hit United States, particularly in Massachusetts became the actual fourth ranked or national in total of COVID-19 cases, third in total number of deaths. And when they started to look at that, Maura Healey, who is actually the Attorney General for Massachusetts, she did a study and she wrote a paper on it and found out, okay, well, we're seeing a high level of African Americans, Latinos, Asians, people of color contracting the virus at a very accelerated rate. And when they actually did some analysis on it, they found out that there's not only an economic issue, but there was an environmental issue. She talked about environmental injustices, where people are living in communities that actually really causes the virus to spread even more so than if they lived in a suburban area or rural area. And most of the people that are living in public housing, and they're living in densely populated communities across our state, are people of color. And when it comes to this understanding, we need to at least recognize that those communities are also known for having a much higher degree of pollution in it. Things are not as clean, or the environment is not as clean, as they say, in these communities as they are in suburban and rural areas. Another factor is that many of those who are going to work and still working, even though COVID had hit, and they were people who were actually had just very, very menial jobs, or just low paying jobs, I should say. They're actually working at supermarkets. They're driving the bus and driving the streetcars, and they're working at grocery stores. And so a lot of these people who are working every day, they didn't get to close down, to shut down, and some of them didn't get furloughed. A lot of folks didn't get furloughed in some cases. Some people are still working. They're people of color. And so they really never had, the proper PPE equipment that they needed, because they didn't know, some how the virus was spreading and all what's going on with that. And so they're still working. So as they're still working, they're bringing the virus home to their families. They're bringing the virus home, and their people are contracting it who live with them. Personally, it hit home to me because I have a parishioner that had died from COVID. She was in my estimation, perfectly healthy. She had no symptoms, as you would say, of illnesses that she had in the past or anything like that. But she died. She died in her early 60s, contracting COVID. And one of the things about our congregation, we had some others that have contracted COVID because they were in positions where they work in hospitals or their family members are working in daycare facilities, and they're out there caring for people and doing everything to put food on their table, but yet they are exposed. And so when we're seeing the high levels of exposure that's coming from them working in these various positions, COVID has just exacerbated the whole problems that we have seen over and over again pre-COVID.
Right. Well, this is a huge and broad systems interrelating to one another in terms of sorting and finding solutions and when to move forward on different fronts. We can do something practically at local levels. And in response to the realities that you're describing, you've been involved in bringing partnerships together. Partnerships that have enabled people to start new businesses, new startups like Tech Angel or Victor for Hire, the landscaping business who does the church properties for you, or Bliss Salon or My TED Talk. Outline, those are all initiatives that I know that you've initiated. So outline for us how pastors, church leaders who believe in biblical justice can become actively engaged in issues and initiatives like the ones you've been fostering.
Well, biblical justice is what I call it as well. I don't just call it social justice. One of my mentors, David Gill, who is a fantastic leader in this area, I met him some years ago, and we were able to come together with some support from the church, from the funding community, and philanthropic community to bring to the seminary, to bring to Gordon-Conwell an entrepreneurship program that would help and assist and facilitate entrepreneurs and those who had ideas to bring to fruition their businesses and to have mentors to help them to develop their businesses. Out of that program, probably now 5-6 years ago now, we were able to help launch 40 businesses, of which many of them are still in operation. My position as a pastor, and as I look at the conditions of my community and what people are dealing with economically, I believe in holistic discipleship. That part of the economic welfare of our people is not only a matter of justice, it's a matter also of discipleship. I think as a pastor, we should disciple our people to understand the responsibility of good stewardship and to how to love our neighbors and as ourselves. And so as a pastor, here's what I think about this whole idea of discipleship and biblical justice. Tim Keller wrote an excellent book called Generous Justice. And he mentions in that book that there are several layers of biblical justice that need to be done if we're really going to see a rejoicing city. He talks about the three I want to just kind of mention is number one, we need relief. Now, I think that as we're hearing our speakers and Eve, and we heard Bob talk about the whole idea of what it really means to, and really talking about, well, we just can't do relief. We just can't do relief. We just can't give money away. And I agree to that to some degree. But there are needs in our communities that you have to have relief. This is not something where somebody just doesn't want to work. This is a pandemic. This is a disruption. It's not an interruption. People's lives have been disrupted in major areas where they'll never get their jobs back, and they may not necessarily be trained in an area by which they can actually move on and get something else. So they do need relief. They have children to support. They have needs that they have to take care of as it relates to their physical bodies and paying for prescriptions. Those are all costs that they have to incur. And so we do have to supply relief. And I think that there's a population of people that will need relief, and they will always need relief. But if we just do relief, I do agree that we stop too short of what the intended goal is of justice and also discipling our people. We need to do development. And so development is the next level, and it means to help people become self-sufficient. There is a scripture in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 13 and 14, that when they had a slave and the slave was actually going to be released, that the slave owner would not release them without giving them some grain and giving them some support. We can't just say, all right, I just want you to just get on your feet because I gave you some money. Well, help me to develop. What about that side of development? And so entrepreneurship is a place where we get to develop people. And I believe that the church has giftings and resources within it to raise up entrepreneurs and raise up people who have business ideas, and they can create good products and do good services. And we found out that there are people there that are willing to get involved in entrepreneurship and ideas and help people. And I believe that we, as the church, can utilize our business men and women in our congregation to do some fantastic things to get alongside people who have business ideas. And even if they didn't start a business, they could actually gain skills to go to that next level and get a job, especially if they're underemployed or unemployed. But then there's also social reform. As a pastor, we have to look at social reform. How do we get our people to be a part of a community where they're being treated fairly? Social reforms mean, simply that, for a long time, and African Americans and women and people of color have not had the opportunities that others have had, particularly white folks. And we have to understand that there is systemic racism. There's systemic things that are happening that is not inclusive in considering people like me. And so as we're talking about that, we need to look at really carefully what is the social reforms that we have to put in place so that there's a level playing field. I also feel for our women as well, as they're doing a lot of great work out there. Well, what are the systems that's blocking them from doing great work and rising to the top and doing excellently and starting companies and moving businesses forward? So as a pastor, my job is to not only encourage people to work inside the church, my job is to help them to be flourishing citizens of the kingdom of God. The kingdom is bigger than my church. The kingdom is involving people and getting them out with the message of the gospel, but also to live according to all that God has desired them to have and do.
Right. Yeah, a holistic discipleship for whole communities. And I've listened to your sermons and the sermon series that you've been doing on the soils. And you're a Bible-based biblical preacher. And so somehow, others think, well, all of that can't go together, but you've just described how it does go together. And it's part of Jesus and his kingdom for cities and communities.
Yes.
Wonderful.
It is. And I agree that we have to work so much harder as pastors to equip our saints, not only for the work of the ministry, but to do the work of discipleship and cause our communities to flourish for the kingdom of God.
Great.
Amen.
Yeah. Amen.
Thank you. We're going to be coming back to you. I can guarantee you that. I want to bring Sara into the conversation. Sara has been very, very patiently listening to all of this. But Sara, you're a socio-economist. So you see the social and the ethical dimensions of economics and finance really in a unique way. And you've worked in this space, as I mentioned earlier, For years, you were a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa. You're a university professor, a consultant to governments and businesses and NGOs, and now you have this faith-based investment role. From your perspective, in the current context with COVID-19, what areas of economic injustice concern you the most?
Thanks, Ken, and thanks everyone. It's a real honor to be on in this conversation with you, and thanks everyone who's joined us. My opinion and my thoughts on economic injustice are just informed by my experience, by church, by people that I see and meet, and also by my understanding of economics, really as a moral philosophy, more than a set of equations or models. And so I think one thing that's important in this day and age that we're thinking of, the question of moral money, how do we use our money in a moral or biblical way, especially in a time like this when there's so much stress and there's so much uncertainty and honestly so much suffering and despair, really. And I think the one thing to keep in mind is that economics and finance are embedded in society and social constructs and social fabrics in families and communities and stories in history. And so when we try to extricate economics and economic ideas and theories out of its truly embedded space, its nature, then we can easily lose of the centrality of human agency. And it's the one thing that this crisis has borne to us and brought home in ways that no one could, I think, ever have imagined. So let me just first say that building off of what Bishop Ward said, entrepreneurship is incredibly important right now. But I do think it's important to recognize that as much as it is a powerful engine of development and growth, it can't be confused with the role of government and even of businesses in providing the enabling conditions for human flourishing, let alone even talking about rights. And so I think that's one thing that we need to keep in mind right now is the economic crisis is obviously a public health crisis, and the public health crisis is an economic one, and it happens to be a labor market problem, and we can't solve that with entrepreneurship. We have to solve that with the government, which is, as we've recognized, whether you agree with modern monetary theory or not, the government's purse is the largest of any entity in society. And so we have to go to that place in order to remedy this really phenomenal 9.8 million job deficit that was generated between February and December. It's greater than, the greatest recession, the Great Depression. We are in uncharted territory, honestly, to the point where, Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, published unemployment rates during COVID have dramatically understated the deterioration of the labor market. That was his quote in the New York Times recently. Janet Yellen, of course, supplementing that, said, we have an unemployment rate that, if properly measured in some sense, is really close to 10%. For economists, that's frightening when you think about how we calculate unemployment anyway, assuming that there's going to be this, chunk of people that will always be unemployed. You couple that with the racial and the gender and the class layers that COVID has revealed, and it's really quite shocking. So we have Black workers who have, in the last 12 months, 28% higher than their pre-pandemic job share they've lost jobs. And then to Hispanic women, it's at 60%. And so those without a high school diploma are actually double their share in pre-pandemic unemployment. And so when you think of the statistics of that, the inequalities of that, and the fact that this is actually a lingering market damage, this is not something that a quick stimulus, because these job losses are permanent. So what this means for the economy is that we can't rely on one or two policies. We have to actually, we have to have every single mechanism at our disposal and use it. And so one of those obviously is federal supplements. And although they are far from perfect, especially since, as we've discussed, they need to be administered from very outdated state systems that are cracked and broken and very, very limited. But these are the best rapid response to unemployment we have, and they need to continue, and they need to continue quickly. The interesting thing about the United States is it took an election in December in Georgia for the acceleration of the COVID-19 infections reinstatement from the government to basically reinstate unemployment supplements. And that's the type of reality that I think we're dealing with right now, which is what are the forces that are going to move the dial and get the money into the economy. So whether modern monetary theory is right or not, the truth is that when people aren't actually buying anything, there's no one getting income on the other end, and so the economy doesn't work. And so you need to jumpstart the economy, and entrepreneurship is, of course, an incredibly powerful tool, but we need the hand of the state in ways that we have never really needed it before. And so just to say that, I think we're at a time from a socioeconomic perspective to understand the embeddedness of the economy in the society, and also in ways that we have, because of our enormous inequality in the country and on the globe, we have really been able to not look that closely at what is broken. And as Dr. Poole said, we are in this state now where what is broken is not just our neighbors, it's ourselves, it's the system that touches everyone. And the only way to get out of it is to understand that we are all inextricably linked. And we can't have a policy for some people and not for other people. And I think that's been a real challenge, because people pride themselves in a capitalistic economy with this idea that freedom is choice and I can choose not to do something. And I think if anything has been learned, hopefully, from this crisis, with all of the death that we've seen, including, I'm so sorry, Bishop Ward, your congregant, we hopefully have grown our hearts to be able to understand that we don't have the luxury anymore to have those positions that are actually quite mythical. And so we're in a time now, I think, where we get to look very deeply. I think one thing that I've been really concerned about is schools and students and teachers. The mental health crisis in this country is beyond description. And we're not equipped for it. I mean, it was hard enough to talk about mental health in schools before this. So I think that's one area where, thankfully with a new education secretary, we can do different things. But, the relationships between people and governments and people and companies have to be reassessed. We have to understand what comes first. And I think I feel like we are making some good choices now. And I'm hopeful, much more hopeful than I was before.
Thank you so much for those insights. I love your perspective. And one of the things I'm hearing, we're going to go to Q&A now, just want to warn everybody. One of the things I'm hearing loud and clear is that these, old debates about government or private sector are just no longer helpful debates. It's not an either or. We need a both and. And we have to ensure that we get the both and right. If we veer too far to either pole, we're going to end up with a bigger problem than when we started. So I want to go to Eve because a question came through. We had a presidential candidate last year, Andrew Yang. He had a lot of followers. His followers were known as the Yang Gang, very wealthy entrepreneur, Asian American, who was talking about the universal fixed income idea before COVID hit. And all of a sudden, it's gaining ground again. And you mentioned it, and you mentioned that even the chairman of the Bank of England is toying with it. Can you just tease that out a little bit more? We might have listeners who really don't understand how something like that might work or why it might be a good idea to consider.
Well, it's just an outrageous idea. I think I thought it was a dreadful idea, just throwing money around, regardless of whether people deserved it or not. Because being from Scotland, I've got lots of very Presbyterian ideas about the deserving poor. It's very Victorian. And I had to have a very strict word with myself when I realized I had a really dodgy theology about this. The reasons that people don't like universal basic income, which by the way is a totally free payment at a standard rate for every single citizen, regardless of your background or your deserving or your behaviour or everything. It is a citizen wage, but at quite a modest level. In this country, they're saying about £5,000 a year. So it's not transformational, but it is a gesture of dignity around buying your own food and paying some basic bills. I think Alaska has a version of it because of some state assets that dividends are given out to populace. Some states have used, I think, freedom dividends and a whole load of stuff which is similar. And of course, in the UK, we've always had versions of it that have been sort of hidden. So the child benefit that gets paid to every single child, no matter what your circumstances, and a pension paid to all old people, again, regardless of your circumstance. And the reasons people don't like it, the first reason they don't like it is political irreversibility, because why would you be the politician that makes this happen only to have to undo it if it got too expensive? Your name would be mud and you would never be elected again. Of course, COVID gives us an opportunity to try all kinds of experiments and to make them time-bound and to get data on them. So that objection is gone. The second objection was my objection, this moral objection about, are you encouraging idleness and will people just loaf about and take drugs and vandalize everything? But actually, furlough and PPP has been a massive experiment in that on a huge scale where people have literally been given money to stay at home. And has there been massive insurrection? There have been some quite particular political uprisings, I know. But in general, there hasn't been an outburst in every single community of bored people with free money from the government running amok and mugging their neighbours and getting up to really bad behaviours. So the idea that it would be sort of immoral or would encourage bad behaviours to give people handouts, I don't think is substantiated. So the conversation in this country, for me, also rests on a really interesting finding from all of the doorstep loan research about loan sharks and household indebtedness. And when they did an analysis of these loans and what they're for, they discovered that very few of them are for, Rolex watches and Nike trainers. Most of them are because your fridge is broken, your car's broken down, your husband's too ill to work. Often they were for Christmas presents or school shoes at the beginning of term or a new uniform. They were for things that people had to buy. And they found out that the average loan was about £280. So that's what, $350, something like that. So they figured that if you had savings of around £300, you would never need to go near a loan shark. And the great thing about universal basic income is it would allow those who have to go to food banks not to have to. So when they've modelled it in Scotland, it would just remove the need for that. It would just remove that kind of destitution altogether. For those who have some money, it would allow people to save to avoid having to get into loan shark territory when disaster befalls. For the middle class, it would give them some money they could donate to charity, because we know that charities have really struggled under COVID, and a lot of them are also shutting up shop. And they're the very outfits we'll need to help rescue us when we're coming out the other end of COVID. So it feels to me that it is a policy that has really found its time and could in one fell swoop address so many different issues and buy us all some time by giving people that sort of dignity. So I think it's hugely promising, more so than I would ever have thought in the past. And I think it's something that's really well worth looking into.
So you're part of the Yang Gang now.
I am.
Ken, if I can just build off of that, one thing I think is very important to remember is, Bob mentioned something about, philanthropy and charitable giving, and we in the world of humanitarian and development aid, we have made quite a turn since the 1950s, 60s, even since the 2000s, honestly. Where before the idea of actually giving people money directly was abhorrent. Why would we do that? These are poor people. What are they going to do with it? They're just going to, buy alcohol and do these terrible things. And the idea was that, we needed to control it because they don't know. It's a sort of infantilization of the poor. And a couple of economists were sometimes useful, put together some experiments, of course, and they they realized that direct transfers of capital, so people literally just cash into their phone and they went and they got money, and the majority of people, like 90% of people, even more, started businesses. So talk about entrepreneurship. And the other thing that's interesting about the universal basic income, which people kind of forget, is just because you're giving people basic needs, funding to satisfy basic needs, schools, shoes, healthcare, et cetera, doesn't mean that they're also not working productively. And as a matter of fact, in some ways, as we know from economics, there's actually economic models that map this out. Aspiration and hope lead to higher productivity. So when you give people the basic needs, whether it's basic income or some other type of influx of capital, which they don't have because, like, the majority of people aren't born with wealth, it does a really powerful thing, which is actually allows markets and the economy to work the way it's supposed to, which is actually give people the chance to make a living. And so I just think the fascinating parallels between that and how we think about donating money around the world, and what we've learned from giving poor people, not just giving them, but investing in them. And so it's really an investment in human societies. And it really does also, I think, challenge our assumptions around human behavior, which challenges some fundamental economic theory, which I think justifies why some people might be against it.
Well, that's really fascinating, and I want to talk about the other side of that coin now, because there is obviously this hugely important role of the private sector, and especially banks. Now, I had the privilege of reading, in fact, supervising Bishop Ward's thesis, and I know that the project he ran was very successful, but it had some seed funding, and access to capital is a big problem in underserved communities. There has been a phenomenon known as redlining for decades, if not centuries, where banks just redline certain communities on a map and they don't go there. Bob, what would you think of the idea of reverse redlining, where we insisted that these banks that participate in the Federal Reserve System are required to invest? Instead of disenfranchising, actually required to invest a percentage of their available capital in those served communities. What would you think of an idea like that?
I think that on the surface, it is a great idea, but we cannot simply make money available to people without some strings attached to it. For example, giving people money is not investing in people. It's just giving them money. And that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to use it in a productive way. I'm working right now with a board in Haiti, and I'm helping to design an educational program to support microfinance, because there are many people who have money that want to enhance the microfinance programs in Haiti. The problem is that people aren't quite ready for it. They need training and education in entrepreneurship and how to use the money. So what we're doing is we're bringing people in to the program by educating them and requiring them to pass certain proficiency understanding before they can get the microfinance loans. I would advocate the same thing for reverse redlining. I think reverse redlining is a great thing, but it's not going to succeed unless we do something to train the people who are getting the money in the appropriate ways to use the money. I mean, I applaud what Larry's doing in entrepreneurship. I teach entrepreneurship. I've been involved in entrepreneurship for years. And in order for entrepreneurship to work well, it takes far more than money. You know, it takes money, but it also takes know-how. And that's what we need to do. See, I am a great supporter and I'm very excited about the goals that we're talking about. What concerns me is that we're not always doing it the most intelligently. The one thing that we have learned over the last 200 plus years in the United States is that free enterprise systems are far more powerful and ingenious than any government purse. And we don't need more money. We need more education, training, and support for the people that we want to give the money to.
So let me bring this back to Bishop Ward then. Larry, your program involved training, didn't it? Do you want to unpack that a little bit?
Yes, it involved training. And we actually gave a profile to those who are coming to the entrepreneurship class, as we did it at Gordon-Conwell. What makes a good entrepreneur? What makes a person kind of like a fit in that entrepreneurial vein? We trained them on how to handle their books. So we brought an accountant and someone who had expertise on how to actually deal with your books. We dealt with law, legalities, and registering your business and making sure that you had the proper credentials and making sure that you had all the insurances that you needed. We talked about marketing. We talked about integrity of how to hire employees and how to actually make out a job description and making sure that you are giving those employees a fair wage and making sure that those employees understand what the skills are needed and can you provide those skills where they are needed to do that kind of work, and are you willing to provide training for that? And so there needs to be a training aspect of it, but we're also thankful for partners that were able to allow us to seed these businesses to get them off the ground because they didn't have the wherewithal to do it. And so, Victor Cuby, who does Victor for Hire, when he came here, he came here from Latin America, and he was actually had some handyman skills. He had no idea that he could actually start a business in lawn care service. So he was able to take that seed money. It was a small amount of money, $500, and he was able to buy a lawnmower. And then we were able to give him a little bit more money, and then through support of his church, he was able to get a van. And then he started getting business cards, and and he's working today. He actually does some work for us as a church, and he's doing well at his business. And so there needs to be certainly an economic part of it where, yes, we got to do skills and training, but boy, that resource, that money really helped out our entrepreneurs to really get launched.
So I want to ask one big question now to everybody, but I'm going to first give it to you, Eve. So as the Third Estates Commissioner, I got it right, the Third Estates Commissioner, you are responsible for investing billions of pounds of the church's money in a portfolio that I'm sure is incredibly diverse. And you obviously are very concerned about doing it prudently and ethically. When you see what's happening in the markets, obviously, the top line, the markets have done very well during COVID. It's been a lot of liquidity out there, and the money had to go somewhere. But then we're seeing a phenomenon like Bitcoin. Why is Bitcoin all of a sudden gaining so much interest? Is there smart money in the market that is afraid things could crash? Are they hedging their bets? I mean, when you look at the landscape right now, what are the things that concern you the most and are the most important things to you from the standpoint of prudent investing going forward?
The Church Commissioners has almost 9 billion, and it's a very diversified portfolio. So luckily we're quite underweight in equities, and so haven't been as exposed to market ups and downs in that asset class. I'm not worried about Bitcoin because I think, we used to have cocoa beans, diamonds, gold, glass beads. There have always been stores of value of their day. Bitcoin is a great store of value. It's a fascinating technology that's been mobilized to help in a whole load of other spheres. It's really exciting. I think, though, it is evidence that people do get that actually, if you look at bank balance sheets, they're all just trading with each other all day. There's very little activity that affects the real economy. And that makes us really vulnerable globally to shocks in that system. And we saw a very recent shock. I think it's very ironic it was Robin Hood, because, of course, Robin Hood taxation would really help if there was a transaction tax on these crazy automated trades that happen. Because the thing about shareholder value, which is, of course, very modern, I write about it in the book, obviously, it's from the 1970s, really, is this absolute nonsense. It's this sort of Santa Claus idea that there's some sort of old man who invested in the company in order to set it up, and we need to keep him in socks in his old age. But actually, the average time for which a share is now held is probably about 11 seconds or something. So, I mean, if you're trying to have an AGM with your shareholders, the page goes fuzzy because you've maybe got a couple of people who are there for the duration of the AGM, who are the pension funds or whatever. Everyone else is blipping in and out because it's automated trading and it's people who are just fractionalizing, all that kind of stuff. So we need to stop that giddiness because it is of no real value. So I would think we'd slow that down with a transaction tax. I think that would be a really good, very specific maneuver that would just take the frothiness out of it.
Wonderful. Bob, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, Eve is correct. I mean, there's been many different forms of stores of value over history. So Bitcoin is really no different. I mean, it sounds complicated, but it's really no different than many other attempts to create other forms of stores of value or currencies. There have only been 8 world currencies in the history of commerce. 4 back in the antiquity times, Byzantines, Greeks, Romans, etc. And then the 4 more modern currencies being Italy, Spain, the UK, and now the dollar. But 8 those are the 8 we know about. But there are stores of value that people can bring to the table. I mean, it's just another currency. You don't have to be a government, to have a currency. Anybody can issue a currency. What you have to have is confidence and trust in who is ever issuing that particular currency. So I agree. I don't think Bitcoin is going to be an issue. I think it's an alternative, but we have seen this play out many times throughout history, and none of them have ever lasted. There's a great book called The Origins of Value. The financial innovations that created modern capital markets that was published just a few years ago, that traces the history of all these types of stores of value. And they're all interesting, but they never really work ultimately because they're not connected to a sovereign state.
Well, you might be interested to know that my sabbatical research is going to be on what the 9th global currency is going to be. So we'll have a lot of time to talk about that soon. I just want to now go around very quickly, ask everyone 1 minute, 2 max. What's the last thing you want our viewers to gain from this really fascinating conversation? I'll be honest with you. I'm a bit of a geek. I could do this all night, but I'm not going to do that because poor Eve needs to have a sharing. So Dr. Minard, what's the last thing you want to say to folks?
I just would say, that with all of this discussion, the personal decisions we make still matter. They're really important. And so if you are struggling with issues on, how to spend money, how to think about money, what is the Christian ethic of, the dollar and how you use it to make a social impact, particularly during COVID-19. In addition to what Eve recommended, which I think is wonderful, just looking at your bank statement, thinking about where you actually spend your money. Another way to think about it is what are your values and how do you align your values with your impact? So for example, if you're really concerned about the environment, how do you treat the environment every day? What do you know, whether it's recycling or whether it's understanding where your parks are in your house, near your house. just getting more connected to the natural world is, I think, particularly with what we've had to go through, really important. And then I would say that there's really cool tools out there to figure out your impact. I just recommend one. It's called IDO Research, EIDO, and they have something called the Kingdom Impact Framework, which is a really useful tool to think about kingdom impact and aligning values with money. And then the good old Sustainable Development Goals, at the United Nations, they have incredibly cool tools on there to think about how to apply the SDGs to your personal life. And so just taking a few moments to really think from a Christian perspective, praying, reflecting, and really going deep and think, what do I care about? What's most important to me, particularly in this time of Lent? And then, think about what you can change within your own orbit without putting too much pressure on yourself, because we're going through a lot, but just recognizing that you can actually make a difference in everyday choices.
Very, very wise indeed. Thank you so much, Sara. Bishop Ward, your final thoughts.
My final thought would be for pastors in particular to educate themselves in the area of faith and work. Encourage your people as they do their work. Find out where they're working. Pray for their companies. Pray for their organizations. Invite them in to talk about the struggles of their work. Give them opportunity to tell you as the pastor and educate you about the various things that they're dealing with, and support them with your prayers and your support, and give them love in the area of their work, and let them know that their work is a part of the kingdom, and it also is a part of God's plan to flourish the earth. And so they're doing ministry. And I know that that's a very difficult word to say these days, that ministry is more than just inside the four walls of the church, but they're doing ministry, and appreciate them for the work that they do, and congratulate them when God lifts them up to levels, and also support them when they have some downtimes and downturns in their work life.
Well, thank you for the role model you are in that very space. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Professor Gough, last thoughts.
My last thoughts are that is really Matthew 6:21. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And what I'm really concerned about is the fact that all these solutions simply emphasize money. And I'm really interested in creative programs that can help people directly. Governments can't change hearts. Only Jesus can. And we have to all realize the power that we as individuals have in helping out our neighbors and helping out broad programs if we're in positions to do that. And to the extent that we can do that, we will be helping the country as a whole.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your continued contributions and your help with the Mockler Center as well. Really appreciate that. And Dr. Poole, I'm giving you the last word as our esteemed colleague from across the pond.
Thank you, and it's very generous of you to include a waif from Scotland. Sticking with Matthew, I would go for Matthew 5:13, salt and light. I was in a church in Cape Cod, and they had this leaflet in the pews, which was their $50 project. And they asked you to think about 3 businesses that you really approved of, whether it was the bakers or the hairdressers or the coffee shop. And they asked you to commit to spending $50 in those places over the next few months. And coming out of COVID, as we renormalize, if we can even imagine that, I'd really encourage you to vote your cash. Where do you want to put that treasure? And is there something proactive you could do to seek out the shop you may not want to use every single week, but actually you'd miss it if it wasn't there, and it's a really important part of your community. So thinking about proactive ways that you could vote your cash, as well as Googling your bank statement, those would be the things I'd leave you with. And thank you.
That is a great idea. I'm going to steal that idea for our little church in Magnolia. And thank you again, Eve, for being part of this. And Jim, of course, thank you so much for your contribution, for your help with putting all of these together. I want to also say on behalf of Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary and the Mockler Center, for faith and ethics in the public square and the public square forum. To all of you who have been watching, participating, asking great questions, please stay in touch. We hope that you'll visit us via the website. We have many more of these events every month. We have them, and there are other seminary events as well. We'd also like to encourage you to consider enrolling in a course at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. You don't have to be a fully matriculated student. We have online courses, in-person courses. We would just invite you to be part of this community that is trying to be a thoughtful, loving, Christ-centered community of global discipleship. So please come. The workers are few, but the harvest is ripe, and we are trying our best to do kingdom work. The last slide you'll have is a reading list. Excuse me. And I hope you'll take advantage of this reading list and read some of these books. So on behalf of all of us, God bless you all. Good night, and thank you for coming. God bless.